afternoon. This is CIVE633, Environmental Hydrology, and today is Thursday, November 18th, 2021, and this is the 13-week second class or second session. We have 2 more weeks of classes, and then we have an exam week, and that will be it for this class. The subject today is the second session on salinity. And we have something very important to discuss at the beginning. The paper by our friend and colleague Arthur Pillsbury. And I'll set it up, get up a history on Arthur Pillsbury first. So let me share the screen with you at this time. Yeah, right. Okay, are you seeing a green screen in here?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yes.
Green screen. Okay. Who is Arthur F. Pillsbury? He practiced irrigation engineering. I think it was in irrigation engineering. Now, irrigation engineering are typically civils. They also could be agriculturals, but agricultural engineering, there's not a whole, there's a whole lot more civils than agriculturals. So I believe, so if I understand correctly, that Arthur Pillsbury worked for various places. I have not read his CV, but I am familiar with his work. He retired in 1981 or 1980 or 81 from the University of California. He was head of the engineering department out there at Irvine, I believe it was Irvine. No, at Riverside. I'm sorry, Riverside. I get them confused. And then after he retired, within a year after he retired, he wrote this paper. And it's an excellent paper. It's full of detail. It shows experience by the gentleman. He practically worked 40 or 50 years even, because if you retire at the age of 70 and you started early at 20, you can work 50 years on a career. I started at the age of 22, so I have more than 50 years at this point. But of course, everybody will retire eventually. So that's Arthur Pillsbury. This is a great paper. I urge you to review it, to read it. Eventually, perhaps for the exam, is packed with details and with experience. But obviously, I don't have the time to go over it completely. But I did an extract, and I'm going to go over the extract with you. So in here, I'm going to close it in here, and I'm going to go to the salinity or extract or excerpts. It's more excerpts. I took some phrases that I thought important for us, for our study. So excerpts from the Salinity of Rivers by Arthur Pillsbury. And by the way, this stuff's going to be on the exam. It's very important. So pay attention. So I'm just quoting the important sentences of his paper. The technical sentences, the one that related to the physics, because that's what we're studying here, hydrology, the physics, the water movement, and so forth, in relation to salinity. He had dealt with salinity because every irrigation engineer sooner or later has to deal with salinity. So he says this. He has a lot of vision, by the way. I love this paper, and I particularly love this particular excerpt that we had done on his work. He said, before man began harnessing the rivers, that was a couple 120 years ago. Well, contemporary society. There's people that harness the rivers earlier, but we're not interested in that at this point. We're not archaeologists. The seasonal floods were highly effective in carrying salts to the ocean and keeping the river basin in reasonably good salt balance. What does that mean? It means that before, when we had floods, the floods will do the flushing, like floods always do the flushing. So the basins were in reasonably good salt balance. Now, it was the first time when I read this paper, it was the first time I ran into the concept of salt balance. Salt balance means there's no salt accumulation with time, because salt appears and it's got to be disposed, and it's usually disposed by the rivers and the flushing of the floods. If it sticks around, it will be flushed whenever the flood comes. The greater the flood, the more flushing. Today, with river flows being regulated by storage systems, read dams, and with high consumptive use of the released water, So we consume irrigation. He's talking about irrigation. Everything that is irrigation is always consumptive. Non-irrigation uses are not necessarily consumptive. Okay, there's not enough waste flow to achieve anything approaching balance. In other words, he's saying off the bat, holding onto this water and using it for our own purposes is causing problems with salinity. Van Schilfgaard also said that in a different way, but he said it. The salt is being stored in one way or another within the river basin. Not only salts are getting bogged down somewhere, but also various measures are being taken that deliberately impede the flow of salts to the ocean. In the US, it is the law of the land, reflecting the demands of both environmentalists and water users, that rivers remain, if not forever, wild and scenic, at least fresh for their entire length. Basically, he's saying that there's a gradient of salinity in every river. It starts fresh, it starts very fresh, like 100 or 200 at the top in the upstream, and then eventually becomes 300, 400, 500, or whatever, however, perhaps even more, before it drops into the ocean. Like the Colorado drops into the ocean at 800. One of the one of the rivers, not the most saline, but one of the larger rivers with largest salinity in the US. And we already know why is that. I've already explained that. The measures being planned are effectuated to accomplish this ideal are dangerous for the future. He's basically saying we should manage the river considering the laws of nature. Nature decided that the rivers were going to be the flushers, with a flood or with a flood, but they're going to be the flushers of the salt, which is always generated. The salt is a byproduct of biology, meaning a byproduct of the biosphere. The general concept is to divert saline flows where they can be found into evaporation basins. He's coming up very critical of evaporation basins. Their water will evaporate, leaving behind layers and layers crystalline salts. It is proposed that the evaporation basins be situated either where the underlying ground is already saline or where the soil is relatively non-porous. Where neither is the case, the ponds are to be lined with a relatively impervious material. Such schemes designed to store the salts may work for a few years, but are bound to be disastrous. Basically, he's saying that you can put an evaporation pond and you can put some liners in there, but they're going to eventually fail. They have a certain life. 50 years, 60 years, you can live through it while you're here, but then eventually they'll fail. So you're leaving like a cemetery for the future, for other people to deal with. Cemetery of salt, a deposit of salt. The salt should be in the ocean, but no, it's not in the ocean, it's in the land. Not to say that there are not salt deposits in the land, there are. There are many salt places out there, but ideally, that's his argument. That's Pillsbury's argument. We shouldn't be adding to the salt. We shouldn't. I mean, this shouldn't is an issue of, I guess you could say, ethics. Should we or shouldn't we? Should we pursue sustainability or shouldn't we? That's an issue of ethics. Ethics is good or bad. Why? The schemes will fail. Although the groundwater under the evaporation basin may well be brackish or saline, every groundwater basin, this is very important, by the way. I love these statements that he has in here. I have not seen this anywhere, okay? Every groundwater basin with a flow gradient must have an outlet somewhere near its lower end. Truth. The saline water in the evaporation basin will serve to increase the head or hydraulic pressure. It's like you're pushing the water if you put more head on top of it. You push the water with head, okay? And will thereby increase the rate of discharge at the natural outlet, wreaking havoc in downstream groundwaters and downstream lands. Basically, you're saying you're passing the problem downstream. It will take some years, but it will be shown downstream. If the evaporation basin is situated above soil known to be impermeable, it will be found that the soil will gradually become more permeable when the waters are saline. He's basically establishing here a geotechnical slash environmental concept. He's saying that the greater salinity of the soil, the more permeability. That means it will get faster to the groundwater. This fact is well established. Many types of materials have been proposed for making evaporation basins impervious, rubber, plastic, etc. Conceivably, some linings will be effective for as long as 50 years, but ultimately one must expect them to fail. Okay. Before the advent of intensive irrigation, which started in earnest around 1903 with the creation of the Bureau of Reclamation, the groundwaters of the western valleys and basins were almost uniformly of high quality. The underground aquifers were largely recharged at the upper end where the rivers disgorged onto the valley lands. The groundwater subsequently discharged into the basin lands and for the most part into the rivers themselves in the form of diffuse flow, meaning it went underground. The flow went underground, it became diffuse because the equation of underground flow or groundwater flow is a diffusive equation. When farmers began pumping irrigation waters, the net effect was to lower the water table downstream, thereby reducing the discharge flow back into the rivers. Eventually, the water table will fall so low that there was no discharge at all. In other words, what he's saying is that if you pump the water and you reduce the base flow, which is draining the salt, the water and the salt, he's basically saying what's obvious. Anytime you drain water, you're draining salt, okay? A certain amount of salt. See, eventually the water table will fall so low that there was no discharge at all, zero base flow. And the aquifers became closed basins. And once they became closed basins, they started to accumulate. They no longer were in salt baths. The only effective way to keep groundwater basins fresh is to pump from wells near the lower end, where the salinity is highest, and to hurry the effluent on its way to the ocean. At the same time, it will probably be essential to augment the recharge near the upper end. And we are doing this, societies are doing this. Recharge is a very important subject, and we'll talk about it starting next week. Unless these steps are taken, one can foresee the day when the aquifers will be destroyed by salinity. And there's a certain amount of salinization of aquifers going on at this point in California, by the way. I'm not privy to the data at this point. One would have to Google that and find out what people that research this subject extensively, like the people up at Davis, for instance, the University of California at Davis, are doing a lot of work in this area to see what exactly has happened in the last few years. I'm not available. I don't have that information available right now. But I know from experience and from having consulted the literature, there's a certain amount of salinization going on in the aquifers, which is it kind of exactly goes on along the lines of what Pillsbury is saying in his paper, 1981. The custom traditionally followed in the U.S. has been to expect the river to carry supplies of fresh water to points of diversion almost down to the river's mouth. Such a design is generally the cheapest and has the advantage of capturing floodwaters. This ignores the basic principle, essential for the long term, of going upstream for supply and allowing the lower reaches to become brackish. Basically, he's saying the rivers are going to carry all the salinity. They are the only ones that can carry the salinity. Therefore, we should allow the rivers to become salt or more saline as they move downstream. This, of course, realizes that we should have management of a basin, not management of a county. And that is a problem, which is a problem all over the world. There's a political division and a hydrological division. Hydrological division is the division of a watershed. Like we have here in San Diego, we got 6 watersheds that flow into the ocean and so forth. You can have examples of that in any place. Yet the tendency is to do the management by counties or else by state. We have federal state agencies that do management and federal agencies too, but they are not necessarily following the hydrology. The hydrology came afterwards. It was an afterthought. There should be a recognition of this fact and perhaps eventually move into that system of recognizing the importance of the hydrology in the decisions that are made about management, particularly of salinity. And you guys know already that you cannot separate the water, the management of water from the management of its salinity. They're kind of intertwined. They can't be separated. Finally, unless, and this is a statement that I really espouse and I totally believe in it, unless the lower rivers are allowed to reassert their natural function as exporters of salt to the ocean, these productive lands will eventually become salt encrusted and barren. He's basically saying, if we don't move that, the salt that is being produced, and salt is being produced on a daily basis. If we don't move that salt out to the ocean where it belongs, we will get stuck with it. An interesting thing about this is that the process is long. It's not 30 years, it's not maybe 100 years, but we will get stuck with it. In the year 2007, I visited the Santa Ana watershed. There's an agency out there. I don't remember the name right now. Management of the Santa Ana Basin. And I talked to the lady who was head of the basin, and I was really pleased that she was talking the right words. In other words, she was basically kind of repeating everything that Pillsbury had said in his paper, which is really satisfying that the people that are doing, she was talking about salt balance and things like that Pillsbury wrote in his paper in 1981. And this is the visit that I had with her in the year 2007. So let me repeat, rehashing a little bit what I just said, the six principles that I get from this excerpt. Exorate drainage systems effectively deliver salts to the ocean. True. Certain amount of waste runoff is needed to carry the salts to the ocean. Yes. If we don't have any waste, if we hold on to that so-called precious water, we will hold on to all the non-precious salt. The objective of waste runoff is to allow the basin to reach a good salt balance. Unlike exorate system, endorate drainage systems accumulate salts without limit. That's true. And remember, we talked about this exorate, there's endorate, then there's partially exorate and partially endorate. We have examples and experience of that. Engineered endorate drainage systems, that is evaporation ponds, that's exactly what it is. It's an engineered evaporation pond or engineered endorate drainage system like Tulare, the 3 or 4 basins that are out there in Tulare, huge evaporation basins. Probably the largest I have seen, and probably the largest in the US. Because why? Why am I saying that? Because it's a large agricultural operation. The larger the agricultural operation, the more salt they produce. Okay? So it's not far-fetched to say that it's probably the largest evaporation pond. I had not seen anything smaller, larger than that, because they cause the number and size of wastelands to grow without limit. Groundwater is likely to become more saline in the presence of endorate drainage basins. So we're talking about groundwater, it will become more saline, but the process is slow. That is the problem with sustainability, that we have a lifespan of 70 years or something on that order, of which a profession is 40 years or something on that order. And there is a tendency to become a little lax because of that fact, the fact that we're not going to see it because it's going to happen 50 to 100 years down the road. So with that, I finished the comments on this, and I'm going to go on to move on some other work, on the work that I have done on this subject, starting, I'm not sure exactly when. Some of these papers I have presentations in here. I'm going to do all the presentations. I did that today. I blew it up. I blew the font size up to number 2 so that I could show it to you clearly. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 subjects in here in the time we have. The first subject is called the price to pay for agriculture sustainability. The precept is that society, meaning us, should be paying for the sustainability. We should not leave the sustainability for the next generation to pay for. Okay? That happened in the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea was put together 100 years ago as as a remnant, or rather as a repository of all the salt that was generated by the Imperial Valley. And the people that preceded us, the three generations that preceded us, did not pay for it. And now perhaps people hope that the people in the future are going to pay for it. Okay? But then to start paying, you got to pay for the four generations before you start. It's like you got to, it's, you know what I'm saying? You got to reset the system, pay for what you owe, the four generations that you owe before you can start doing it afresh and nice, right? So I'm going to explain some of the things, some of the basic things that happen here. Some of them are obvious and some of them are not obvious. Apples are part of the biosphere. The apple grew from a seed. The water came from surrounding environment, the carbon dioxide from the air, and the solar energy from the sun. What is not immediately apparent is where do the nutrients come from. It requires nutrients. Energy, water, carbon dioxide, and nutrients. Without any of those, production, life as we know it, cannot happen. Every product of nature has a certain requirement for nutrients and different requirements. And that is why some crops can grow here, other crops can grow there. For instance, the US is a land race for berries, all kinds of berries in quantities, just the way it is. Nature put that together. Okay, other countries specialize in other things. For instance, Peru is a land race for potatoes. I recently read, I thought it was 2,000, but I recently read there's 4,000, or I read somewhere, I heard somewhere, 4,000 varieties of potatoes in Peru. 4,000 varieties of potatoes in Peru. Here in the US, we get maybe 5 or 10. The others, we don't get, we don't market them, we don't produce them here. We produce some potatoes here, they originated, of course, in Peru eventually, 500 years ago, but we do not produce the variety in color, taste, size, species that is produced in Peru. Why? Because out there, the conditions are such, the natural conditions are such for the productivity, for the development of the, over years, of course, of the potatoes. And that's what they have done. Okay. Chemical elements are needed of a specific type and quantity in the construction of the various products. Macronutrients are required. Macrominerals in lesser amount, and micronutrients is in much lesser amounts. Macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Those are the big ones. The part of the acronym NCHOPS: N, nitrogen, CHO, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and PS, phosphorus, and sulfur. We already discussed that. The macrominerals are the four: calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. And we already know that potassium and sodium are used, most of it. Most of its production is used by the biosphere. And the micronutrients are boron, chlorine, cobalt, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, zinc, and others out there that are used much less, in lesser quantity. The construction of the biosphere cannot proceed without sufficient quantities of all these four elements. Water is limiting in arid and semi-arid environments, so humans have learned to transport it to places where it is scarce. Example, California, Southern California, not Northern California. California has blessed the Golden State because it has diversity of weather, all the way from Dead Sea, rather Dead Sea, I'm sorry, Death Valley, where it doesn't rain hardly at all, to the corner, the left corner of Northern California, where it rains, I believe it would be like on the order of 40, 50 inches per year. It's a lot. In the SI system is 4,800 millimeters. It's a lot. It rains more in Northern California than in the Amazon. Can you believe that? When I found that, I was really aghast. I didn't realize that it was like that. The Amazon has a rated precipitation per year of 3,200 millimeters. In Northern California, it rains 4,800 millimeters. Yes, there's a lot of water out there, a lot of trees. The tallest trees in the world are not in the Amazon. They're in Northern California. They're fascinating fact, okay? how tall they are? They're about 80 meters high, the trees of Northern California. The top of the canopy in the Amazon is about 60 meters. So how is it possible that we have this small system over there, which has taller trees than the Amazon, which is supposed to have a lot of water? Well, the, this system in Northern California has more water, actually. And not only it has the vertical precipitation, it also has the horizontal precipitation, which we already have talked about. So it's a double whammy. And I have explained to you that this happens everywhere in the world where you have the so-called cloud forests. You have a forest that has a lot of clouds, and the clouds concentrate, or rather not, condense into the stems, and they produce more precipitation, which you cannot measure. You cannot measure drops because it's all in the air. Carbon dioxide is usually not limiting since it is a constituent of the atmosphere. I read today this morning and I updated this figure because the current figure is 410 parts per million. I had not updated this for a few years and it was like something like 380. It's going up. We know that. I just can't believe that people out there can actually not believe what's going on in the science. But it happens. It does happen. Solar energy is primarily a function of latitude and season. So solar energy is something you get as a gift. If you live at the latitude of 32 degrees, which we are right now in San Diego, we have a certain amount of solar energy. Not as little as the poles, but not as much as the equator, because in the equator you get more solar energy, right? The mystery are the nutrients. Which ones are needed, in what quantities, and where do they come from? The answers to these questions belong to the science of agronomy. The people that are in charge of growing the crops, they have to study this and figure out what exactly is that they need so they can give it to them. Because agronomy is artificial. It's irrigation agronomy. We have people dedicated to grow crops. That's the practice of agronomy. Why? Because there's a need to grow crops. Because the population continues to increase. The population of the world is increasing at the rate of about 90 million per year. Right now it's at 7.9 billion. Next year it'll be at 8 billion. Mark my words, we'll see it published. It will come out in the papers. 8 billion people. In practice, the nutrients are either native or imported. Soils that naturally have an array of nutrients in sufficient quantities are said to be fertile. Conversely, soils that do not have a good supply of nutrients are usually improved by the addition of fertilizers. So you have to add fertilizers. Typically, we add fertilizers because we tire the soil out by getting all the nutrients, productivity, crop production. And eventually the soil says, I don't want to do it anymore. I don't have the nutrients. You either fertilize me or else you can't produce. And we end up fertilizing, right? The Haber process in the year 1915 was developed in Germany by a gentleman named Haber. And in the Haber process has the capability to grab the nitrogen from the air and put it into the plants or into the soil for usage by the plants. Because without the Haber process, we cannot get a hold in enough quantities of this macronutrient, which is nitrogen, which is 78% of the air. So figure we're looking for nitrogen, we need the nitrogen in large quantities, and where to get it? This gentleman produced the way to do it. High pressure and so forth. I don't recall the details. That's all been documented. Okay, nutrients. Native nutrients originate in the soil and parent rock. To use the nutrients, the plants engage in symbiotic relationships with their own root fauna, a process referred to as bioturbation. Bioturbation goes on everywhere. Bugs are everywhere. Microbes. Objective is to accelerate the process of making these nutrients available for uptake. Weathering is an intrinsic part of the process. So you got physical, chemical, biological, all kinds of stuff going on in the soil. The soil is dirty. People said, oh, soil is dirty. Nothing further from the truth. Without soil, we couldn't live on this planet. We couldn't extract fast enough the nutrients from the rocks. Easy, right? They have to be disaggregated into soil because when they're disaggregated, They're like sort of cut into very many infinite number of pieces, and then the bugs can go in there and pick up the pieces from the surface. They don't have to. They don't have to deal with the soil. The soil is already been and the nutrients had already been exposed so that the bugs can use them. Demand for each nutrient exceeds the supply, the plant is unable to develop. Conversely, the supply exceeds the demand, a waste is produced. Generally, plants are able to use most of the nutrients through weathering and bioturbanation. There are two notable exceptions, sodium and chloride. Plants do not need sodium. Chlorine is a general biocide, which means that it will kill all life if applied in sufficient concentration. We apply chlorine, I'm sorry. Chlorine is chlorine is Cl2, is the molecule of only chloride. And chlorine is applied to the water. The disinfection of most water, potable water, is done with chlorine. We ingest a certain amount of chlorine because the water has been disinfected. That's the least of many ills that could happen. So ions of sodium and chloride constitute the mineral sodium chloride, halite, in geology. Are there halite formations out there? Sure. The history of the Earth is 4.6 billion years. We've been only here 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I visited, many years ago, I visited Bogota, Colombia. About 100 kilometers north of Bogota, Colombia, there is a place which is a salt mine. A salt mine. Now, how is it that a salt mine could be produced out there? The answer is pretty simple. That area used to be in the lake long time ago, maybe 500 million years ago, and it collected all that salt. And then eventually broke through its channel and it's no longer in the lake. It has a big river out there. The Bogota River drains the valley of Bogota. So as you can see, by knowing the principles, we can go back and surmise what may have happened 300, 400 million years ago, like a geologist, and then we can decide what to do for management. That's important. We need to manage to a certain extent. Okay, over the course of millennia, this natural waste has resulted in the oceans being saline. We already know that. Disproportionately high percentage of sodium and chloride in the oceans may be attributed to the fact that marine life is responsible for the precipitation of calcium, but not of sodium. We already know that. Okay, we already know that. I will repeat that. Now we go to hydraulics. To feed increasing populations, humans have developed hydraulic systems to move the water where it is in short supply. The idea, both ancient and contemporary, is to move the water and make it available where it is needed. You know, when I studied hydraulic engineering, I studied all the mechanics, mechanics when I went to school 50 years ago. But at the time, we had not posed to ourselves the question of why are we doing this? We just had to go to school, study something, right? Study civil engineering. And we studied this stuff. Later, we came to realize after reading and a lot of study that it was necessary to have hydraulic engineers so they could be in charge of moving the water. Why moving the water? Artificially. Because we need it. Why? Because the people are going to try to concentrate on the dry areas, and they're going to be needing water to be taken to them. That's exactly what we do, particularly here in California. In California, we move the water from the north to the south. And if we were not for the 2 or 3 channels out there, particularly the California aqueduct, we could not survive here in the south, right? The next question is, why don't we all pack up and move north? That is a political question. Nobody's going to want to do it. We're already established in the south. We like the sun. There's not that much sun up there, obviously, right? So because an arid system, an arid climate has a lot of sun. Temperate climate does not have as much sun, and we already learned to love the sun, even though the sun could kill us. We know that, but we try to protect ourselves, right? Only recently we have realized that in moving the water from one place to another, we're also moving the salts. That is true. We didn't know that when we developed Tulare 100 years ago. Now we know. Even the people that operate Tulare know that. It is extremely difficult to manage the salts. And it is fascinating that we have a system in Tulare and San Joaquin, and if you cross the mountains, the California coastal range, and you end up, and you go a little bit further south, then you end up with Imperial Valley, which is kind of the same thing. But they have different people which chose to do different things because the mountains were in the middle. You know, we have the California coastal ranges in the middle. Yet through evapotranspiration, irrigation uses only the water, leaving the salts behind. Invariably, irrigation leads to an increase in on-site salinity. Van Schilfgaard said that in his 1991 paper. When this is coupled with deficient drainage, the stage is set for an environmental disaster. We have a water disaster here, a salt disaster. Since the salt is coming with the water, it's a hydrologic disaster, an environmental hydrology disaster. To remove the salts during irrigation, there's a need to apply water in excess of the consumptive use. I have an example that I posed as we talked about this last week, and some of you are already working on it. I received 1 or 2 answers to that problem that's due next week. The excess is the leaching fraction. This practice leaches the salt out of the root zone and creates a return flow or drainage water, which needs to be managed carefully because of its increased salinity. And I'm going to do a parenthesis in here to compare, and this is for the purpose of one of you that is doing this work as a paper. There have been 3 irrigation systems that have been developed over the last 100 years. The first one is called gravity flow, and that's the one that originated everything. But then some people realized that they were wasting, quote unquote, too much water. 40, 50% of the water was wasted. So then they decided to create something more efficient. And they did. But it was efficient in terms of the water, not efficient in terms of the salt. Had they known the whole thing holistically, they would not have done it. But they didn't know. And this happened maybe 50 to 100 years ago. They started developing the sprinkler irrigation, which at the time everybody thought about it and everybody said, oh, hey, this is a great thing. We're saving water. Yes, they're saving water. They're also saving salt because the water goes with the salt. We have not learned how to separate it where, right? Furthermore, a few years later, maybe 20 years later, 30 years later, something new came up. Even sprinkler irrigation was too wasty, so to speak, wasted too much water in the minds or in the eyes of somebody. So then they developed drip irrigation. In the drip irrigation, and you guys know what I'm talking about. I actually have a drip irrigation system here at home because they've installed it for your gardens, right? And the drip irrigation is supposed to hold all the water and not release any water, not waste any water. But the problem is they also hold on to the salts. So eventually, both of these systems, both sprinkler irrigation and drip irrigation, have to apply some leaching fraction, otherwise they will die. And they do it and they don't tell anybody. How about that? It's very hard. And I have Santos working on this problem. I already talked to him about it. He needs to find out where has it been discussed that you're applying a leaching fraction to the sprinkler system and to the drip system. You have to. Otherwise, you will die. You will be out of business because the salts are there. They were not removed. And you cannot evaporate the salts. Okay? Sources of salt, we already know that. We already talked about that, so I'm going to skip that. I want you to review it. So the price to pay is that we need to have a surcharge out there to pay for the cleaning. And we have not done it so far. We have not done it well. In various places it's being done more or less. We haven't done it in the Salton Sea. In the San Joaquin, we're doing it to an extent. To this point, people are even discussing how to do it and who's going to pay for that. Who's going to pay for it is important. Obviously, everybody has to pay because you're eating stuff. And if stuff is produced and there's a waste to be done, you got to pay for it. Okay? Somebody's got to pay for it. The city pays for our waste removal, but then they charge us. They charge us in some other way. They tax us in order to pay for the waste. You think it's free? No, it's not free. It's not free. The city in San Diego does great with that, but it's all coming from taxes. The city, they're coming from taxes. They have the ways of collecting taxes. Okay, so Finally, I come up with my version of this whole thing. I say ocean disposal is the only sustainable solution. Is the objective is to conserve areas where food and fiber can be grown productively. Meaning, we should try to preserve the concept or maintain the concept that we have to waste some water carrying the salt, because the alternative is to cart it out, to cart the salt out. For a hundred years, the Salton Sea has been accumulating all that salt, and they have not thought about a way of carting it out. They could actually, but they haven't done it because it's expensive. We calculated that it was about 500 tons per day, something on that order. My memory is fuzzy a little bit, but we did that calculation. How much salt? So you multiply 500 tons per year or per day. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. It's in my papers. It's a paper that I have in there that I didn't have you guys read because it was too technical. It was very detailed. So I decided I wasn't going to waste your time. But it's there. The paper is there. Whether it is per year or per day, and I'm not going to say it is the same, but multiply that by 100 years, and then you get the volume that you got to remove. That's all there is to it. Okay? So that's the first paper, which is called The Price to Pay for Agricultural Sustainability. The next paper is to drain or not to drain. That is the question. The oceans cover irrigation and salinity, a pervasive problem. It's everywhere. The oceans cover about 70% of the Earth's surface. Figure one. That's right, 70%. 69% is the number, actually. Through geologic time, the oceans have been the natural sink for all solid materials. And we know how much solid material is in the ocean. Marine life is responsible for the precipitation of calcium, not sodium and chloride. Sodium chloride has a high solubility. It actually goes in there and dissolves. So you got sodium and chloride. There's no such a thing in the ocean as sodium with chloride together. They kind of dissolve, okay? High solubility. It's one of the highest, if not the highest, solubility. That's a chemical concept that implies how fast does the water, how fast the ions, cations and anions get into the water. Sodium chloride is unique. It's really unique. Professor Ponce has called it the error of nature, but that's very disrespectful of Mother Nature. So I'm going to take that back. Its supply exceeds the demand almost everywhere. Its components can be used to produce acids, and hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide for industrial use. So I may not like sodium chloride, but I would like sodium and chloride when they're separated. When I was over in Mexico, Baja California Sur, at the salt plant, huge salt plant that they have out there, I asked the boss out there, the manager. I was visiting the manager, and he was guiding me or doing a tour for me of the facilities. I went there with two students. That was about 25 years ago. I don't remember the exact date. And I asked a question. I always ask a dumb question. I figured no question is dumb, completely dumb. And I said, you guys are producing all the sodium chloride, mountains of sodium chloride, and you're taking it to Japan because the firm, the company, the plant is Japanese. It was Mitsubishi. So I asked them, I said, why are the Japanese interested in getting all our salt, all Mexican salt, that was drawn from the ocean, right, because the ocean has a lot of salt, and ship it over there in cargo, I mean, tankers that fill their volume with salt. I've seen it. I have pictures of it. I've shown the pictures in the previous paper. So I asked that stupid question. Why are they why is it that the Japanese are interested in all that salt? And he looked at me like I was the dumbest person in earth. And he says, well, they want the components. They want the hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide for their industrial uses. And the two basic elements, in addition to CHO, are sodium and chloride. But sodium is explosive. The same, they're gases. Sodium is a gas, so chloride is a gas. And they have a tendency to explode. So they're like, it would be dangerous to transport them individually. But if you put them together, they kind of like each other. They get together and they become solid. And you cannot destroy that unless you drop it in water. If you drop it in water, it'll destroy it because of the solubility. But if you don't drop it in water, it's okay. I pulled up a sample of halite in that visit that was 20 years ago, a big sample, a chunk of salt. And I believe I still have it around here at home. 20 years later, nothing happened to it and nothing will happen. It's solid. So they use the sodium and the chloride together as sodium chloride for the objective of transporting long distances safely. The important thing is safely. The components of the industrial requirements that they have over there. In Japan is an industrial power, they have industrial requirements. Otherwise, they would not have done it. They're not dumb. Okay, so that's basically the idea. What the use of sodium chloride is only for the purpose of transporting its constituents. That's the only thing that we have found out through the years where science has been developing. Okay, so salts are always present in the rocks. We have calculated that to be, I believe, about 2%. Of the four salts, 2%. Okay, saline environments are uncommon in the natural terrestrial world. That is actually not quite 100% correct. Nobody's perfect. There are places out there that have a lot of salt, but it has to be luck of the draw. Let me explain. The peripheral regions in the continents all drain into the ocean. Example, a case in point, Italy. Italy doesn't have a drop of saline matter over there. They don't talk about salt because they don't have any salt. Why is it that Italy doesn't have any salt? And we have a lot in here. Okay, we have the entire Great Basin, the entire state of Nevada is full of salt. Okay, Italy, why? Because Italy is a narrow country and it's surrounded by ocean and it has hills. It has hills. I've been there. Okay, so when it rains, and it rains a lot, it is in a temperate region where it rains somewhat. Okay, not a whole lot, but the farther you go north, the more it rains. That everybody knows that. So Italy has a lot of water. It has a lot of mountains. It has a lot of mountains, therefore it has a lot of salts. But the salts disappear under the ice because they get flushed all the time into the Adriatic and into the Mediterranean Sea. Very simple. Okay. Europe doesn't have too many salts because they're lucky. Luck is important because the geomorphology has made it possible for them to have large rivers and to drain. They drain north, they drain south, they drain everywhere, right? England is the same. England doesn't have any salt problems. They also small area surrounded by water. Okay, Spain is kind of large and kind of unlucky because they do have a salty region southeast. I was there. I visited. Okay, that place is so salty that it almost looks like Nevada or like Arizona, which are deserts. And that's the reason why Hollywood in the 60s, when they wanted to do cheap Italian Westerns, they didn't do them in Italy. They did them in Spain, in southern Spain. They had everything done out there. I was there. I visited out there, actually. I was interested. They set up a system in Spain where they can do all the filming for their spaghetti Westerns because they're technically being done by the Italians. But they were Hollywood. There was a mix out there that I don't really want to get into as to who originated those ideas. But the fact of the matter is, I'm talking about climate here. You have to go, if you want a far west type of Arizona type setting, you got to go to southern Spain, east southern Spain. Almeria is the place, Almeria. In Spanish, it was Almeria, which is where they produced the spaghetti westerns back in the 60s and 70s. I don't know if they do that anymore. Okay. The essential purpose of the rivers is to carry the solids. Evaporating runoff through additional evapotranspiration creates a problem of salt disposal. This is fascinating. I mean, the people that invented irrigation, certainly here in the United States about 100 years ago with the bioreclamation, they hadn't realized this. They really had not realized this. Okay, I'm going to say that, repeat that because it needs to be said. They didn't know. Ignorance. Ignorance is bliss. Okay. Later on, they had people like Van Schilfgaard. They would come out after 30 years of practice and say it. Remember, I talked about that already. And furthermore, they would come out with people like Pillsbury that also said it. Pillsbury, 1981, Van Schilfgaard, 1991. People that had worked with irrigation for 40 years came out and said it. This is the way it is, guys. This is the truth. And that it was the truth. Okay. Problem is compounded by the fact that there's all kinds of salts. So we have in here natural and artificial and new and old. We talked about that when we talked about the Salton Sea, all the 4 types of salts. And we already covered the ground, so I'm going to skip it. Pervasiveness of irrigation in society implies that excess salinity is also pervasive. Excess salinity is produced by irrigation. Irrigation produces excess salinity. Okay, then we can say something like this. We can say, okay, let's forget it. That was a mistake. Started 100 years ago. Let's forget about irrigation. Let's not do irrigation. Then comes the role of what it's called dryland agriculture, meaning we're only going to grow crops when it comes from the rain. Okay? And that is an interesting concept. It's an environmental concept, but it's a concept that is not pursued throughout the world because of its economic consequences, right? Can you imagine we going out there and telling the people from Tulare Lake Irrigation District and Drainage District, okay, guys, you're not going to be doing any more irrigation because just the government doesn't like it or society doesn't like it. So what are they going to do? They might as well fold, right? But no, that's not going to happen because they're going to fight you, and eventually if they have enough political power, they will prevail. So there is an issue that intertwined with politics. Politics is the science and art of what's yours and what's not yours. That's all there is to it. Okay. If the right is yours, the might may be somewhere else. Think about that concept. Okay, the San Joaquin Valley, we already talked about the San Joaquin Valley. I'll come back if I have more time, but all this stuff we have already reviewed. Okay, we have other things to do here. So basically, I'm going to go into the next subject. Oh, I messed up in here. Okay, so sustainable irrigation, the price to pay, to drain or not to drain. Sustainable irrigation, I believe this is the next one. Yes. Yeah. Sustainable irrigation. I wrote these papers maybe 15 years ago. They're papers not even dated. They're papers just to show or tell a story on the web, which I have a few of these, by the way. Okay, so let's go. I have this one and one more, and I think we're going to close at 7:45 correctly. Pristine rainwater. Pristine rainwater has very little salt, typically less than 30 parts per million. Yet surface runoff often has more than 300 parts per million. How did that happen? As water moves through the land, it picks up solids because it's not moving over concrete. It's moving over the rivers are moving over the land, and they're picking up salt all the time. That's why Pillsbury said in the headwaters the rivers are clean, and the downstream they're dirty. That of course also depends on where the rivers go through. If it's a river that goes through arid lands, it will get dirtier as it goes through. But if it's a river that goes through humid lands, it will not get dirty because it doesn't have any salts to the landscape doesn't have any salts to deliver. The case of Lake Superior. Lake Superior drains well, very well, through the St. Lawrence River through the Atlantic Ocean. It is the lake we have documented with the cleanest water in the US, 60 parts per million. That is 1/4 to 1/3 of normal. It's the cleanest, 60. Okay, there's a river in California, Northern California, which I don't remember the name right now. I think I already mentioned to you, is the cleanest river in California, 80 parts per million. So just compare those two numbers with the normal. Colorado 800, normal standard 200 to 300. And there are some rivers out there that are saline. In Portugal, I visited many years ago the Sado River. Sado in Portuguese means salty, the salty river. So how is it that we have these rivers that are salty? Well, all there is to it is that the draining areas that have become closed through geology, and now they all of a sudden become open because there's ways that happens. Okay, like the Colorado River, which is salty, not just because it is draining arid areas, but also because it is getting out all the salt that was collected in the old um, closed basin when the Great Basin was larger. The Great Basin now has been reduced because some of that dropped into the Colorado. Enter humans and their need for food and fiber. The more humans there are, the more food and fiber we need. We have now a problem. Well, I'm not going to get into that because we'll never get out. We have long learned to tap the fresh waters. Irrigation is a product of human ingenuity, entailing the return of surface water to the land. Irrigation is a problem of physics. How do you get the water? How do you efficiently get the water? You learn hydraulics, you learn fluid mechanics, and you do it. But we do not consider all the side problems. Irrigation engineers are technically not biologists or they're not sociologists. So that's where we come into recognition that there's a need to know more than just a specialty. Okay? In nature, a return of surface water to the land is the exception. In other words, when nature drains the water into the river, it leaves it into the river and it drops it into the ocean. It does not put it back because of gravity, because of flow, and so forth. The flow of the river cannot go move upstream. It has to have a gradient to move upstream. If we moved it upstream, yes, we provide the gradients. In Mohawk, and we have an example of this. I think I'm going to show you that example later. Let me just hold on to that for a while. Because we have a way of pumping water all over. In Welton Mohawk in Arizona, I visited Welton Mohawk about 12 years ago, and I saw in photographs something that was so curious and so interesting. There were two channels, and I think I've shown that picture before. There were two channels on the ground. One of them was moving water upstream, and another one was moving water downstream. And how is it possible? And the distance was 40, 50 miles. So how is it possible that in one plot of land, you can have water moving upstream and downstream? And the answer was, the water that's moving upstream is being pumped. The water that's moving downstream is flowed by gravity. You see how it works? We put the pumps in there in order to make the water go do what we want it to do. That's called irrigation engineering. An interesting example of natural drainage service is provided by Lake Titicaca in Peru. The water is fresh. The water of Lake Titicaca, if it didn't have the outlet river, it's called the Desaguadero River, it would be salty. And it would have how much salt? Remember, I talked to you already on this last time. The amount of salt in a lake depends on its age. The lake in Asia is 13 ppt, which is only a third of what the ocean. So that's why it's called fresh water, kind of fresh water. So Lake Titicaca is actually relatively clean, not salty, because it has a chance to drain. Not as much as Superior, Lake Superior. Lake Superior drains a whole lot, drains everything. That's why it's so clean. Lake Titicaca has a salinity value of about 1,000 parts per thousand. I'm sorry, 1 part per thousand, 1,000 parts per million, which is about 3 times the norm. So you could say, actually, that number 1,000 is the limit that people that work with water supply consider that that's the highest that you could use as potable water. Any more, it would be a problem, right? We should not be drinking saline water. We should try to make sure that the water that we drink has as little salts as possible. That is why Professor Ponce has a filter I installed many years ago. It cost me about $4,000 or $5,000, a filter to run clean water, because we decided that we were tired of hauling the water from the water store, right? I had to haul it every week. I said, no, that's not what I'm going to do. I ran into some money at the time, and we just called up somebody to do it, and they did it, and the system works perfectly, by the way. It's a great system. I'm not encouraging, I'm not saying you should do that, but you should consider that into the future if you're drinking tap water. Otherwise, drink bottled water. You should not be drinking tap water, particularly here in San Diego. But you could in Los Angeles. How fascinating. In San Diego, we can't, but in Los Angeles, we can. Why? Because in Los Angeles, water is coming from the north. There's no Colorado water that goes into Los Angeles. So the water coming from the north starts at 80, 100, 200, and it gets there and it's fine. But the water coming to us, it's coming mixed. And the current value is 475. Although you couldn't find that value on the web. Google salinity of San Diego potable water, and you won't find it because it's a mystery. Okay? Sustainable irrigation. Irrigation always produces salts. Can irrigation be sustained indefinitely? That is the question that Van Schilfgaard posed in his paper, 1991, and he did not answer it. He could not answer it. If he said no, he would have been lying. No, I'm sorry. If he said yes, he would have been lying. If he says no, he would be shooting himself on the foot. So he decided at the end to say nothing. How fascinating, isn't it? 5 alternatives to ocean disposal. And this is kind of the example that happened in the San Joaquin. We're going to do some mentioning in here to the problems in the San Joaquin. And we'll basically wrap it up in here is the ways to solve this problem. The ways to solve this problem. 5 alternatives have been considered in the San Joaquin. River discharge. River discharge means get it all the way to San Francisco. Water reuse. Reuse the water for second and third use. And it can be done, and they are doing it. Because some plants can take DSM of 2, 3, 4, like pistachios, for instance. The pistachios are very tolerant. Remember, we talked about crop tolerance. We have charts on that. We already talked about that. Water treatment to remove the salts and cart them away. It could be done too, expensive, but it could be done. Evaporation ponds, which is what everybody's doing. Well, not everybody, a few. The people of Tulare are doing evaporation ponds. They've been doing it for 50, 100, 50 to 70 years. And deep injection well. I don't like the deep injection well. Because you're going to use energy to do it, to hide it in deep ground. You never know what's going to happen. And you can create earthquakes, by the way. It has been demonstrated that when things happen like that, you can create a local earthquake and damage property. So that's not good. Okay. In my opinion, the best thing that you need to do is river discharge. Run it through. That's the only way we can do. Or don't put it in the river. Put it into a pipe. Run it through the coastal ranges and drop it into the ocean. And that was considered, by the way. But then again, the issue of NIMBY comes up. NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. When they try to do that and drop the stuff over at the coast of San Luis Obispo, I don't recall the name right now. The local people oppose because it's a beautiful place. They say you're gonna mess up our beach and our sea. So then the issue, if you want to do something correctly from the environmental standpoint, you're gonna face social opposition. That happens all the time. I don't need to tell you. You already know this. Many of you are environmental engineers. Okay? So the only way to evaporate deep well injection, no, the only way to assure irrigation sustainability is ocean disposal. Brine lines are a necessity of heavily impacted watersheds. There's 2 brine lines in California. The Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority, that's the people that I met with in the year 2007. They have a brine line. This is the brine line. I took a picture of it. This is at the end. That's the Santa Ana River, and with the estuary, because the Santa Ana River has no water. But in order to find the Santa Ana River clear of water, you got to move upstream, maybe 2-3 miles, because there's a slope in there. That's seawater that's come in because it's been opened, right? It's an estuary. It's a constructed estuary. 100 years ago, it was just a mess. I mean, water was everywhere, but they put it into a channel, and there it is. And right next to the channel, we have this outfall from the Santa Ana River. That the pipe in there is carrying the outfall. And My understanding is that I don't not only carries the salinity, but also the human waste, a certain amount of human waste. So it's a pipe to get the waste out into the ocean. It's a mix. And they've done it for many years, at 30, 40 years. So, so that's it. And then there's also the cayewas. Interestingly, the cayewas I read recently, somebody told me that the pipe that I've shown you, the huge pipe, 48-inch pipe that I asked, at the time I asked the engineer why it was so big, and he says, we're not gonna do this again. So they constructed a 48-inch pipe in the year 2008. It had been operating for as long as, until this time, but it actually failed. It failed in March of this year. They had to quickly fix it. Not only it failed, but it failed in, for a while, I don't know exactly the exact time, but I think for 24 hours, until they actually got there and fixed it. It spilled all the salty water into the adjacent property. So now the people operating Callejuas Brine Line need to go in there and compensate the farmland because they got it full of salt. They got to compensate, they got to drain, they got to go. It's a mess, legal mess also, by the way. So the San Joaquin Valley, we already covered that ground, so I'm not going to dwell on that. So I'm going to now read the last one, which is this one over here, the resource dilemma. We only have 10 minutes. We're not going to do it justice. Actually, we are. We are. We have 9 minutes. Let's do it. Resource dilemma. The settlement of less than optimal lands. Water and nutrients are fundamental natural resources. They are at odds at both extremes of the climatic spectrum. And in here, we're going to go back and talk about the concept of 800 millimeter isohyet, which I developed in the year 2011, I believe. There's plenty of water, nutrients are in short supply. Where there's plenty of water, nutrients are in short supply. We know that. Conversely, where there is very little water, nutrients abound. Ecosystems need both water and nutrients. In humid regions where rainfall is more than 1,600 millimeters, nutrients have leached through millennia and only limited quantities remain in the soil profile. That is the reason why we cannot populate humid areas. That corner of California that has 4,800 millimeters precipitation is not populated at all. And we can't move over there because we need the water, right? But we also need the nutrients. We would rather have more nutrients, excess of nutrients, than excess water. I can tell you that for a fact. I can explain that maybe later. Okay? So if the choice is too much water and no nutrients, or too many nutrients and no water, we always choose too many nutrients and no water. And that's the reason why there's 40 million people in California, and the large percentage of it, at least 2/3 of it, are in the south, all the way to San Francisco. And by San Francisco, we run out of steam. And from San Francisco to the border, which is almost half of the state, is largely unpopulated. That is a fact. Okay? Many years ago, because of the water fights in California, there were people that were proposing that we should split California into 3 areas, but that never progressed because everybody would lose division, right? So they didn't do that. So I'm not even going to pursue that. It didn't happen. It was an idea that did not catch at the time. The deserts are fertile. Once irrigated, they tend to be productive, very productive. We have proven that to be the case. The mean annual terrestrial precipitation is around 800 millimeters. This amount of precipitation is in the middle of the climatic spectrum, separating semi-arid regions less than 800 from subhumid regions more than 800. And to be honest with you, I haven't figured out why is one called semi-arid and the other subhumid instead of semi-humid. That I don't know. I'm not going to dwell on that. That's an English language issue, okay? One would think if you want to order things, and Professor Ponce always likes to order things, I would call it semi-arid and semi-humid, or sub-arid and subhumid. But no, that is not the case. It's semi-arid and subhumid, okay? Since arid regions have limited water and humid regions have limited nutrients, it follows that the availability of water and nutrients must be close to optimal around the middle of the climatic spectrum. And that is true, by the way. India is a case in point. India, India has 1.4 going to 1.5 billion people, 5 times or 4.5 times the number of people in the United States. Not that that we are necessarily wanting more people, but they're strong because of that. They have large quantities of people. Okay, they say that the number of scientists, people that have PhDs and very educated in science, in India exceeds every country in the world because they have a tendency to study science, and there's too many of them, right? As a matter of fact, I've heard the figure 100 million. 100 million Indians are scientists. They're everywhere. You know, you count the number of scientists in the U.S., 300 million. You just count them. I don't know the number, but it cannot be 100 million. We don't have 1 out of 3 persons a scientist, master's, PhD, and stuff like that. A case in point, the Sahara Desert and the Amazon rainforest, which are both lightly populated. So the point is that you have Sahara Desert, you don't have any population. If you have the Amazon, you don't have any human population. You have a lot of bugs. The bugs love it, but not human populations. Humans don't like too much water because it brings the bugs, and we cannot sustain the bugs, basically. You can go to the Amazon rainforest if you want to see the greenery, but 3 days is, I'm saying, that is the maximum you will take. After 3 or 4 days, you come back to California, the paradise, because here you can choose your weather. Out there, you cannot. So why is it that our people out there, the natives, so-called, that are still out there? Because they, through the generations that have been used to that, the bugs don't bother them anymore. You know, it's kind of, they learn to defend themselves against it, right? So that's the point. And there are still, mind you, native peoples in the Amazon. Although the Brazilian natives are disappearing as we speak, while the Peruvian and Ecuadorian are still there. Why? Because it is simple. It's a very simple geomorphological problem. Peru and Ecuador, their rainforests are limited by mountains, so it's difficult to pass through the mountains. While Brazil, no, Brazil doesn't have mountains. They don't have mountains. So for them to move from the east to the west, which is where the Amazon rainforest is, it's very easy. So I've done it over 100 years. When I was on the Pantanal many years ago visiting, don't forget that I'm from Peru, okay? And I was talking to this professor over, and she says, we have hills over here. And I looked around and I said, hills? Where are they? He says, right there. I said, what? She says, yeah, there's a 3-meter hill over there. I said, 3-meter hill? I still didn't realize what she was saying. As a matter of fact, out there, an elevation of 3 meters is a hill. Because they know that when it floods, the top of those hills are the only places that do not flood. And that's why they have a tendency to put their cattle. They have a lot of cattle out there. Okay, so whenever it floods out there and 50% of the land is inundated, the cattle, there's about 10 million heads of cattle out there, is rounded by the cowboys, and they put them on the hills, and those hills are 3 meters high. Can you believe that story? I hardly could believe it when I learned about it, and I saw it, and I stood on the hill. Okay? Improvements in social and political organization coupled with a quantum leap in sanitation and public health. I could speak an hour on this, but I'm not going to. We don't have the time. We want to get to the end of it, and we're almost done here. The settlement of the Western United States is an example. We wanted to settle the West, and we created the Bureau of Reclamation, which aided the settling of the West, but we were not considering the issues that I'm talking about here today. Okay? The settlement of arid regions. To settle arid regions, humans have learned to move the water. That's the purpose of hydraulics, to move the water where the people are. This has led to irrigation. The settlement of the Western United States in the early 1900s could not have been possible without irrigation. That is true. As a matter of fact, I believe Reisner is the guy that wrote the book on Cadillac Desert, the water problems of California. I believe he was the one that said that once California settled the western U.S. in the 1800s, 1850, 1860, 1870, California, and then California first because of gold. But then eventually all the states followed one after the other. Arizona only became a state, I believe, in the year 1912. So Arizona was the later ones to become a state. But at that point, or about the turn of the century, people realized that they couldn't live with the droughts without any support, any physical support. So they complained to the federal government. And they basically said, and this has been written in the book, by the way, this is not a creation of Professor Ponce's mind. They told the people in Washington that if they did not underpin the civilization, the artificial civilization that they created in California and other states of the region, that they were going to drop it and go back to wherever they came, Illinois, Missouri, etc. Obviously, the government in Washington was not going to like that. And so they created the Bureau of Reclamation. It was Teddy Roosevelt, 1903. And the Bureau of Reclamation did an excellent job of coming up with the necessary hydraulics to support the population. And they still do it. But then the whole project came back later on to haunt us because the salt problems were not addressed at the point. And maybe they could not have. Maybe if they did address the salt problems, they would not have done it. It would be too costly. Do a calculation, it's too costly. We can't do it. Benefit cost, right? So maybe they did it and they had to learn through experience, or we had to learn through experience. And finally, I am already over here. I'm going to show you the famous picture. Welton Mohawk Irrigation Project. The canal in the left comes in this direction toward us and it's pumping water. They have 5 huge pumps that cover the entire width of the channel in order to push the water upstream. Okay? And the canal in the right is the drain, which is being drained by gravity. Actually, and I'm going to finish here, this project is the only project that I know that pumps its water to get it in and it pumps it to get it out. Why? You have to pump it to get it in because it's upstream. This river drains into the Colorado. It drains downstream. They identified the desert lands that needed irrigation, that were going to be productive. And it's an extremely productive system, by the way. Production is what they're doing here. The more they produce, the more salt they generate, right? That is a truism. So they developed this and eventually realized within a few years that they had to drain, like in the case of the Salton Sea. So they created the drains. They actually pumped. They used the well pump, the well that existing there. They had these wells for extraction of water when they didn't have the canal. And they finally, eventually, the wells were not used. And then somebody came up with the bright idea that what we need to do is use the wells to pump the water out. Pump the water, the salty water that has been created artificially, we're now going to pump her out. So they pump the water out and they drain it through this canal to the right, which contains about a sixth of the water. In other words, if 100 units are moving on the left channel, 16 units are moving on the right, but they're in opposite directions. Fascinating story, which I do believe does not exist anywhere else, because nobody has the wherewithal to pump that amount of water upstream. I mean, it's done in California, but where else? Around the world? I honestly don't think so. I haven't heard of. But I reserve judgment because there may be places out there, don't forget there's more than 200 countries. There may be places out there that have done this. The Chinese are about to do it, and I'm going to close there. The Chinese have run into money over the last 50 years. We know that. Right after the revolution that they had, 1968. What is it called? The social revolution. It was not a communist revolution. They were already communists. But they had a social revolution, the cultural revolution. And then Mao Zedong dropped, like I say, he died. And then all of a sudden, the Chinese, after the Cultural Revolution, decided that they were going to switch the ways. Whatever reason, I'm not privy. I wasn't there. All I know is that they did switch. And in 50 years, they come up very powerful because they're quantity. There are a whole lot of people out there, and they have a tendency to be hardworking, right? You have quantity with hard work, you end up with the Chinese miracle. 50 years, look where they are. So now what they want to do is develop their arid lands, just like California did it. How fascinating. They're going to do the same thing we did, emulating or copying, as a matter of fact. The question is whether they'll have the foresight to do it right. I don't know that. I don't practice there. But I'm telling you off the bat, and I'm hoping that somebody out there is watching this, where they have the foresight to do it right. Since we made a mistake, and since everybody already knows the mistakes, then they should do it right. But I can tell you that's not going to happen. They have large areas, the Gobi Desert on the western north part of India, which is not only a desert, it is endorreic, large portions of endorreic. Just check it out on Google Earth, endorreic systems. So they're going to have to do something to solve the problem.